Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're talking edit mode. Edit mode is where all the magic happens, basically. It's where you edit your objects. So if I say I'm modeling something, it's all in edit mode. I'll go through all of the tools that I often use, but there are also other tools that you can experiment with. It depends on what you do. So this is basically my workflow. So to see this, let's add a circle because that's one of the models that have basically nothing when you start. And so it'll require a lot of extruding and a lot of inset in order to get something that looks more like a 3D object. Also a plane. A lot of people do use planes to start modeling and they shape up something like a face or a car. All of these things sometimes start with a plane and then trying to extrude and mimic the shape of the outer edge of that shape. Okay, let's start with a circle. Usually, a circle comes with nothing for fill type, but I like to use Ngon, even though you can add a face in edit mode if you select the circle and hit F, but I like to add it beforehand just because I do have the option. There's also a triangle fan option, but I don't really use it because it's not perfect topology for the majority of the things that I create. So I'll choose an Ngon. I think that's how you pronounce it. That's how I've heard people pronounce it. Also, if you hear my voice go back and forth, it's just probably my allergies acting up because I've had a headache yesterday, and that usually happens when my allergies are going crazy. Now, let's go into edit mode. Like I said before, if you want to go to edit mode, you can either go from the top left corner and you go to edit mode, but because it's one of the most used parts of Blender with objects, then you can simply hit tab. If you click tab, then you're in edit mode, and you hit tab again, you're going back to object mode. Even if you go into any of the other ones, it just flips from the other ones to edit mode. That's tab. So it's basically turning on and off edit mode. Okay, so right off the bat, there are a lot of tools on the left. And if you don't see any of those, then you can just hit T to show it. But right now I just hit it. So it's a toggle basically. Don't worry about all of these. These are transformation tools. We can do the same thing with S for scale, R to rotate, and G to grab and move. We've learned that before. And I'm going to remove proportional editing. I have a few things turned on because I just filmed a part for the reel. And this is the cursor. So if you click on this and then you click and move, it moves the cursor to a different place. And the cursor is basically where your objects emerge. And it's also used for transformation. If you want to change the pivot point, then you can just do 3D cursor. So you can move the 3D cursor to wherever you want. And then we have the annotate tool. I don't really use this, but many Blender tutors, tutorial makers use this to annotate. I'm not going to use it because I don't know how to erase the annotations. I have never used it before. And then this is for measurements because some Blender users do use it for architecture and interior design, and that requires specific measurements. That's why these all are in meters, or technically only this. I don't know what this is, honestly, so we're not gonna go into it. It says add a cube, but I'm not sure if it adds an actual cube, like from here, or if it's something else. And then we come to the interesting part. These are the tools that I use, starting from here, and the first one is extrude. If you follow any modeling tutorial, they're gonna use extrude. That's one of the most used tools in edit mode when it comes to modeling. So we're definitely going to use this. And then in extrude, you're going to see a little arrow. If you click and hold, then you can see the other tools. And they're all related to extrude. But there are different ways to extrude an object. There's one where you would want to extrude along normals, but I think if you extrude and scale, that's technically what it's doing. And then there is extrude individual. I've used this a lot of times. If I want to create a star out of this circle, for instance, then I will say extrude individual, and that will ensure that my extruded parts are not connected to each other. So they're not creating like an outer circle, but they're actually creating little edges coming out of the circle. And then extrude to cursor, I have never used before, so I don't know, but I think it extrudes towards the cursor. That's just my guess. And then extrude region is what I use the majority of the time, and it's what we're going to use today as well. And then inset faces, insets a face, and we're going to use it first so you can see what it does. If I hit I, or if I just click it, if I click it, then I can just move this part and inset the face that I've selected. And of course, as you might guess, this only works on a face. I'm in vertex edit mode or vertex selection mode right now, but if I go to face, then the face should be selected. So if I'm in edge mode or in vertex mode, then I have to select it all in order to select the face that all of these edges and vertices are connecting to make. So it's going to work even if you're in vertex edit mode or selection mode. I keep saying edit mode, but you know what I mean. And you can then inset the face. So if you click on this and then just inset, you can actually see it inset. But I like to use, instead of clicking on these tools, because now I'm stuck with this tool until I actually change it to this, which is the selection box. But if you use the shortcuts, and I think I've said this before, you can just do your task and then it'll release that tool once you click the mouse and apply. So if I hit I can just inset the face and then click my mouse and the tool is not selected anymore. So I can do anything else and it makes things much faster. And then also inset face has like bevel, which we have talked about before, has this toggle menu where you can actually adjust a few things. So let's say the thickness is something that you don't like, then you can just do this. I don't know what depth does, but apparently it does that. So we're gonna keep it at 0 for now. Like I said, I've only used some of these tools for certain things, so I've never used the depth before. I would just move it upward with G. And that's pretty much the same exact thing. So I wouldn't know when you'd want to use the depth. Maybe if you want something a little bit more specific, again, with movement, you can do that. And let's use extrude. So extrude is E as the shortcut. So I'm going to go E and then go up. It's automatically or by default locking it to the Z-axis, but you can also lock it to the X-axis or Y-axis, but I know why would you want to do that, so it's Z usually, but if you have something from the side, then of course that would be X or Y, depending on its orientation. And then I just click and that will apply it. And then we have bevel. We can do bevel right now, but I want to do something else before. And bevel we talked about before, you can just hit Command B like you see in the tooltip where it says shortcut and then it says Command B. And this is where we want next, the loop cut. So this is to create edge loops. This is my most used tools when I want to add mesh or when I want to add some geometry to my mesh, or if, let's say, I want to use the cloth physics simulation, that requires like a certain topology. It requires a lot of squares. If it has triangles or rectangles, like really long rectangles, then it's kind of like the weave on a fabric. So weaves usually are square. If they're not, then they're going to create some like rough edges at certain points. So it's kind of like paper. If I want to create paper and crinkle it up, like I want it to look like crinkled paper, then it requires triangles with the cloth modifier or the cloth physics simulator, because paper acts differently and it's made differently. So yeah, if I want to create cloth that actually looks like cloth, then I'm going to create squares or perfect squares using the edge loop. So let's say I want to puff this up. I definitely don't have any geometry for this to work as a cloth because it's just long rectangles. So to do this, I can hit Command R like we saw over here in the tooltip, and then I'll hover until I see something like this. So if I go over here, it's creating an edge loop over here. If I go in between those, then it's creating an edge loop over here. But I need this. I need to add more geometry vertically in order to create squares. So I can puff this up if I wanted to. I mean, I'm not going to do this here, but I'm just saying that that's what I would do. Then I can scroll my mouse. If you have a mouse with a wheel, then just scroll that. I'm going to scroll on my magic mouse until I get something that resembles some squares. I usually look down here or up here and see if that like is almost a square. And I just click. But now you get to slide it to wherever you want. You can either click where you want or you can hit escape so you get the default. So I got the default and now I have a bunch of squares. This is perfect topology for cloth simulation because it's all squares. And even with character designers, if they want to move their characters, they're going to have good topology because as you move your armature for your character, then you're going to see some deformity in certain areas because your topology isn't perfect. So perfect topology is basically a bunch of quads laying nicely to form the shape. And of course, the more details you want in a certain area, the more topology you're going to need there. But yeah, now I have many edge loops, and because they are perpendicular to those vertical lines, then they're also going to create vertices over there where they intersect. And that's basically a loop cut. And if also you click and hold in this one, you'll get another one where it's similar, but it definitely has its uses. I never used it, or I never use it because I've probably tested all of these. That's why I cannot say I've never used them, but I've never used them in my workflow since I started my Bookstagram. Okay, now the knife tool I've used before. Usually when edge loop or loop cuts don't work, so let's say on something like this, they won't work because they try to look for something to intersect with. So here it doesn't work. You can just inset the face over and over again and then they will work in between those. But let's say I want squares that go like this instead of going round, because you can definitely inset this face and create something resembling squares, but you don't necessarily need exact squares like here. You can do something like this, but let's say you need it for your cloth simulation for this to actually look like it's woven in a certain way, right? Then you can use the knife tool. I've only used the regular knife, which is K, and you can just select one of the points, click on it, and then drag and select the other points. It's going to snap and it's going to show you that it's on there, and then select it. It allows you to go further. So let's say you want to go perpendicular to this. If you have mesh over here, you can, but I then just hit enter. It doesn't work with mouse clicks because it'll add geometry, so you can just hit enter and then you have a divider over here. But we're not going to use this, and I don't use it that often. I only use it to correct certain areas. Like for something like this, if I want to use the cloth simulation, I will just inset the faces until I get a bunch of quads going around. This is polybuild. It's, let's say you modeled something, you sculpted it, and then you want to build quads on top of it, then you can just use this one. I don't use it because it's mostly with people who model a lot of models with intricate details like character design, basically. Like I like to watch a lot of tutorials even if I'm not going to create them or necessarily learn what they're trying to actually teach, just to learn Blender and to see how things are actually used. I think it's just the teacher in me. I think teachers like who love to teach loves to learn. And I bet that's the reason why I like to watch tutorials of things that I will never create. And then this is the spin. Okay, spin I've used maybe once or twice in my life, and I still don't fully understand how it works. We're not going to talk about spin right now until I figure out how it actually works, and maybe later, like in some other video, we can talk about it. Smooth I never really use. I use the smooth modifier. If I ever need to smooth things out, I usually try to focus on making my models really nice from the beginning and clean, so I don't need smooth. And then this is edge slide, and I think it does that exactly. But you can do the same thing. So let's say I click this one, I can do the same thing with clicking the G twice. So G is going to move this, but if I click G again, it just slides it in between the 2 points, and it stops if it hits any of the edges around it. I hit escape to remove the tool and not do anything. And then the other one is shrink and fatten, but I like to call it just add volume. I'm going to call it shrink and fatten like in my shortcut guide, but it just annoys me. Yeah, and the other two I just don't use. Any of the pink ones I don't necessarily use that often. Okay, now let's go through a few other things in edit mode that are not in this toolbar. There's a humongous menu over here compared to object mode, where we only had 4, because we haven't added vertex, edge, and face. Like I said before, if I, let's say, don't have a face over here. So let's say I hit X and then I hit faces, so I deleted the face. I can double click the edge. If you double click on part of it and you see this selected, then just try to target the part in between the 2 vertices, so you're actually clicking this line. And this way you actually have the entire edge loop selected. And now if I go to face and I say fill or grid fill, you can actually have a grid. But my favorite way of doing it is just hitting F so I get back my n-gon. If I have a square, then I use grid fill because usually that works pretty well. And then there are other things that you can use, like bridge edge loop. Let's show you how I can use this. So let's say I want to duplicate this part and move it on the z-axis, and then I want to connect the 2. So how do I do this? I select, I hit shift and then double click on this part so I can select this edge. And then I go to edge, bridge edge loops, and it'll create edges for me. So it created a bridge basically between the 2 and it connected them. And now I have a longer hat and I can just do Command R and add more edge loops this way. And click again to apply it. Let's undo all of that because we don't really need it. So those 2 things I use very often. Also, like I said before, you can hit G twice to slide, but you can also hit R twice and it'll rotate in every direction. It will show you what is happening when I select everything. So if I hit rotate, right now it only rotates based on my view, because right now I'm technically in front view, not really. It's rotating around the y-axis alone because that's what's facing me and my voice is going away. But if you hit R again, then you can actually rotate along all axes. And nothing really happens when you click S twice or you hit S twice on the keyboard. So that's something that I use often. Well, I use the slide tool more often than I use the rotation. I like to rotate on a specific axis the majority of the time. Let's edit this a little bit more. I will hit Option Z on the keyboard to make it X-ray mode, because if you select with no X-ray mode, also my object is blue, is because I have face orientation on. Just because whenever I extrude, I sometimes flip the normals and I have the reds outside when you should have the blue on the right side. So yeah, I will keep it on just because I need to see it. So if I have front view, then I just select like this. I look, it's not selecting the back edge. It's not selecting whatever it can't see. So Option Z makes it transparent, and so it's kind of telling the tool that, oh, by the way, like you can see everything, so there's something on the back. So if I select right now, we can actually see it all selected. I know I can double click on this and it'll select the top edge, but with some parts, I can't do this. So let's say I don't have a perfectly round model with perfectly connected edges, something a little bit more complicated, then you're gonna need this, because sometimes I want to select like a certain part like this, and I want to select the back edge as well, so I can, let's say, move it somewhere else. Okay, so I select the top edge, and then I want to scale this up. So if I scale it up like this, it's not really doing anything that I want, because what I want is, let's just hit escape, is to make this part of the hat bigger, but I also want it to go smooth from the bottom part over here up to here. I can go edge by edge or loop by loop and just make it bigger until I get what I want. But there's a simple way to do this. You can hit O for proportional editing as the shortcut, or you can click this part. And you have a bunch of ways to make things follow your cursor. Or it's basically fall off, as in from the center of the circle or from your range to the outer edge. How do you want it to actually look? Do you want it to look like a sphere, or do you want it to be just smooth, or the other ones? So I usually use smooth, sphere, and sharp, depending on what I need. So if I want an edge that maybe looks like a seam of a fabric. So if, let's say, I wanted to add a seam to a pillow, for instance, I'm going to use the sharp, because I need it to be like proportional, but I need it to be sharper. So I'm going to use smooth because what I'm trying to do needs smooth. And then I'm going to hit scale, S for scale. And then I will scroll my mouse to adjust the range. And then I will scale up and click to apply. So it's kind of like a Mad Hatter, or I'm trying to actually make a clown's top hat. I've already made a couple to try it out, but this is like, I think, the fourth one I've created. And now let's also bevel it. So Command B to bevel, and you can scroll your mouse to add edges or segments, and you can then adjust them over here however you want. Okay, I'm going to add 3. So I have 3 segments right now, 1, 2, 3. And if I click away, like I mentioned in the bevel video, you can hit F9 to go back to the menu and you can adjust it. Now I'm going to click Option Z to go back or to toggle off X-ray mode. And then we can add a solidify. With solidify, you get blue from the inside as well, because it's adding geometry from the inside as well. And we have a hat. If you want to add bevel to the rim as well, you can apply the solidify modifier, double click the edge, and then bevel it. But right now I can't, because this is not real geometry. As you can see, it doesn't have any vertices or edges or faces. It just shows you what it might look like if you apply it. This is a non-destructive workflow. In edit mode, it's destructive. And then hit tab to go out of edit mode, right click to shade smooth, and let's also add a subdivision surface. I'm going to make it simple, and then you can also make this. And the smaller the range is, it's not going to do anything to the other points. But you can also hit O to remove proportional editing. And voila, you have a hat. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not going to keep it this way. For my work, I'm going to adjust it a little bit. I didn't use solidify, but it's much easier for you to learn it if you just add solidify and then you have an object. But you can then apply the solidify modifier. So let's say I apply this right now, and if I go in, I actually see it working, and I can double click and shift double click on this part as well, move it down, and just be careful when you double click like this and then shift double click the rim. Sometimes some points do get clicked, and then now all of these edges are going to also be beveled if you want to bevel. So what I like to do is go into edge selection mode, and I select this edge and this edge. This way these are not selected, because I'm not necessarily selecting the vertices over here, and I'm selecting the rim only. So if I hit B, and then I can reduce the segments with my mouse, or I can wait for this once I click to adjust it. I also like to bevel these edges as well, and it makes it look cleaner. And I can go out of simple for subdivision and go back to the default. and it looks really nice and clean. And now if I want to, let's say, use this volume, and this is where Option Z or X-ray mode works. Let's go to front view and let's select this part. See how it only selected, and then I can select this part as well. And now I only have the bottom part selected and none of these selected. Now I have all of this selected. I can hit Option S, and this way I can add volume to the edge. So I think I should have not selected that part. Okay, let's try it again. Option S. Now I have a rim that is tilting a little bit upward. So that's another way you can use the width tool, which is what I'm going to call it. Okay, that's all I do basically in edit mode, but just note that you can also add a bunch of objects over here and it goes in the center, just so you know. So if I move it, I actually didn't want to add a circle, I wanted to add a sphere. Okay, so let's say I add a sphere, scale it down, move it upward over here, or let's say I want to add it to like the hat itself. If I go to front view, I can see it better and align it. So let's say I wanted to add a ball to my hat, and let's shade smooth again just because this wasn't shaded smooth. And now this is one object. So you can also add a lot of different objects inside of your object, and they will all be called whatever the object is called. So right now it's called circle because that's what I started with. Let's say I call it hat. And as you can see, I have a lot of objects that I've created before. And then if I move it, it moves with it. If I scale it, it scales with it. And the same goes for rotation. But if I hit tab to go into edit mode, and let's say I want to select this circle. I know it's a separate object. I know I didn't extrude it from this object. I can hit L while hovering on it, but just make sure that you're not selecting anything or that you're selecting part of the object that you want to select. Because let's say I selected part of this and then I hovered over this and hit L to select linked. This is going to move with it wherever I move it. So let's say I want to move this, it's going to move it and it's going to ruin your mesh. So make sure that everything is deselected and then hover over this and hit L to select linked. So this is basically selecting all of the linked seams. I've only used seam before. So yeah, and we're talking about my workflow. So that's basically what I do. Let's say I want to select only the hat. I can deselect everything by selecting outside, and then I can hover on the hat and then hit L to select linked. And that way I can move the hat alone. It's not really something to fear if you have a bunch of mesh in the same object, basically. And last but not least, one very important thing to note is that if you select your object, so let's say I will hit L on this one as well. L is a very challenging letter to say for an Arabic speaking person because we don't really have L's that are heavy. We just have a La that are softer. So closer to French, basically. So if you see me struggling saying the letter, don't worry about it. Okay, so if I select everything and then let's say I scale it up and then I go out of edit mode, if I go to the object properties over here, I can see that my scale hasn't changed. And that's a good thing usually because there are a lot of modifiers that won't allow you to have a scale other than 1. So you always have to apply your scale. Let's say I scaled this up and now it's 1.2. That's not good because it's acting as if everything is scaled up that much, but I needed to act around this as if it's the initial scale of it. So I can just hit Command A and then apply the scale. And now it goes back to 1. But we don't need to do this if I just scale it in edit mode. So yeah, note that anything you do in edit mode is destructive, 100%. So location isn't changing, rotation isn't changing, scale as well. Okay, and that's pretty much it. I think I've covered everything. I mean, I do have my notes on my notebook right next to me. So I'm checking them over and over again to make sure that I haven't forgotten anything, but that's basically what I do if I ever go into edit mode, which is almost in every project. Okay, it's thumbnail time. Now, when it comes to edit mode's thumbnail, it's a little bit more elaborate because I had a lot of things to play with as opposed to the previous ones, because technically all of the modeling happens in edit mode. So let's go through it. For the Reaper's Scythe, I think that's how it's called. I don't really know all of the terminology in English. Again, Arabic native speaker. So for the scythe, I added a curve for this one, and I just drew it with a pencil, and I added a depth with bevel, and not bevel in edit mode, but bevel for the curve properties. And then I turned it into a mesh and fixed the edges. And also so I can UV unwrap it and add the wooden texture to it. So I kind of had to turn it into a mesh anyway. And then for this part, the knife part, I either used a regular cube or a round cube, but I think a regular cube. And if I go to edit mode, you can actually see what is going on. And let's isolate it as well. So it's a cube, and then I extruded this part until I got this shape. I also have reference images for all of these to put behind my mesh so I can work with the shape of the image. And then I added edge loops over here and over here to make this look more like a cube rather than like a mushy circle, because once you add the subdivision modifier, everything is just smoothed down too much, and you'll have to add edge loops to certain areas, because the closer the lines or the edges are to each other, the sharper the edge is going to be. So if you look at this area, it's going to be sharper, but because there is no edge loop over here, this is smoothed down like this. And for this one, it's just a plane that I turned into a grid. There's also an add grid over here, so you don't have to add a plane and subdivide it. But if I want it to be a rectangular shape rather than like a perfect square like a grid is, then it's better to just create a plane and then cut it with edge loops, so you make sure that you have squares or quads rather than a bunch of long rectangles, because the grid stretches out whenever you scale it. And then I use the cloth modifier. So this is not necessarily me doing it in edit mode, but it is edited later in edit mode. So whatever problems I had after the cloth simulation, then I can just edit it in edit mode. I usually do that. I apply the cloth modifier, so I just use it to kind of model my stuff. And then I do apply the cloth simulation, so it's not moving anymore, and it's just a mesh that I modeled through simulation. And then I can use sculpting, which is not necessarily in edit mode, or I can just edit the mesh directly in edit mode. I just really wanted to add a ghost because it's really fun. And for the cauldron, I just used a round cube. I removed its top edge. I removed its top face, or its top faces, because there are multiple on the top. And then I extruded and scaled, extruded and scaled again. And then I added a solidify modifier and a subdivision modifier. So you can see that the edges aren't really smooth, but once you go out of edit mode, it's smoother, and it's going to even smooth down more when I render it, because for render I did 2. So if I go 2 over here, it's better. I tested it out and it works, so I have it at 2. And then these are just curves that I placed. There's nothing really fancy about them. And also I don't remember saying, but I think, okay, none of these are curves anymore, but maybe this, like the balloon string, is a curve. Okay, the edit mode for curves is different, but it has similar things. So it has extrude and it has the radius, which is like the shrink and fatten in the other one. And then there are other ones that I've never really used. I think randomize is to randomize like how the points sit, but I don't like to use it because it randomizes it, I think, on all axes, and I don't need that. Yeah, I just needed to mention that real quick because I didn't go through it. I didn't go through the edit mode for curves because it's really small, and I kind of showed it in the curves video. And then going back to the cauldron, for these, I did a bunch of icospheres, and then I add them all together. You can also use metaballs. If you go here, add metaball, and you can add a ball. They already stick together like this, but I prefer just using regular icospheres or spheres even, and then remesh them. I just chose icospheres because they don't have that weird pointy bit on the bottom and the top a sphere does. And so it's much smoother all over when you add the subdivision and the remesh. And I simply just duplicated them inside of edit mode, and that's what I talked about before. You can just make them into one object, which is a good thing here because I also wanted to remesh them, and you cannot remesh multiple ones and expect them to mesh together. I just created them in edit mode, and then I made them like smoke or bubbles and remesh them and add a subdivision modifier. As for this hat below, let's go down just because I wanted to get this out of the way because it's what I created for the reel. So this is the clown hat that I created for the reel, and I also created another one that is pointy. So instead of just going outward, I went inward. And I also added a rim that goes upward, so it's not just like this, I actually extruded it upward. And I added 2 circles or 2 spheres like I did with this in the beginning of this video as well, because we created this as well. And then for the balloon, I just used, a round cube. And I pushed it down a little and then extruded it a little bit so it flares like a regular balloon that is tied up. And then I added a string. They're not one object. I have multiple objects for these. And then for the pumpkin, which I also created similarly for the October TBR post and tracker, but you can't really see the face on that one, and it's not really that great. I just needed it to cast shadows when I put lights in them onto the ground for the trackers, so I didn't really care that much how they looked from the front. So this I had to care a little bit more about. So if I go into edit mode, it's a mess. It's a round cube it's a sphere that I pushed from the pointy top down here and up. I clicked on both of them. I turned on proportional editing and I scaled them on the Z-axis. And it created this shape. And then I did some loop edges and used the knife as well to make the teeth because these are so big, like the faces are so big. So I had to make a bunch of smaller ones over here to make the teeth, and then I cut out all the ones that I didn't need. And I did the same with the eyes. I cut like a hole in here and then I adjusted them to make them resemble a circle. I also did some knife cutouts here or edge loops and deleted some of the faces to make the nose. And then I finally extruded the top part to make the stem. It requires a little bit more than what I just said, but modeling is not an easy task even for me, so I just try it out again and again until I figure out how to do something. So this pumpkin I did the second time this time because I did it the first time for the trackers and the TBR. So I already knew what went wrong there and I tried to fix it here. And if you go close, you can actually see some of the errors over here, but because it's not like a close-up, I didn't really mind. And I wanted it to look creepy. Like I didn't mind some mistakes here because it's just a creepy thumbnail. And just an FYI, to isolate, you can just hit /. I do have shortcut guidelines attached to all of the videos, so if you ever feel like you're gonna miss something, just go to any of the videos. I definitely mentioned the / and I added it to one of the shortcut guides. I just don't remember which one. And last but not least, for the things that I created in Blender, the bone. I did have a reference image as well, and I used a cube. And I just extruded it until it fit the shape, and I added a bunch of edge loops where I needed them. Also with 3D modeling, I mean, it's in the name, you have to actually look at your model from all views, because for something like this, you can create it following the reference image, but then you can forget sometimes about the different axes. So for this one, I did create it on the front view, and so it was a little flat, and I had to go back and view it from the side to make these a little bit larger on the edges or on the sides so they make something resembling a circle. And with subdivision modifier, it looks something like this. Also, I do edit with subdivision turned on sometimes, just to make sure that I can actually see things after the subdivision is applied. So I do turn on this edit mode display. And the last thing is this text. This I just created in Illustrator and I inflated it in Illustrator. I also did all of the drips in Illustrator. And then I brought it in here and I used sculpting rather than edit mode, honestly. I just don't care with the text. Even with the previous tutorials, I just inflated them with the cloth modifier. And I didn't really make something with what the tutorial is about because it just didn't look right when I first started it. I didn't really like the looks of them without any editing, or I honestly wanted them to stand out. And with just, so let's imagine for the curves tutorial, if I just did it with curves, they wouldn't stand out as much as the other ones because cursive tend to be a little hard to read sometimes. So I just thought, okay, for the titles, I can do whatever I want. And then I simply added some clay-like or slime-like look with the sculpting tools, which is kind of similar to edit mode, basically. So if I go to sculpt mode, it also has a lot of tools, just like edit mode. We're definitely going to go into that someday. And I also made this go down a little bit so these will look a little bit drippy. And I used proportional editing. I selected the eye first and then I used proportional editing and I moved it down, and so these parts just moved down with it. Yeah, and I just, in edit mode, I just moved some of these because this is just one object since I exported it as an OBJ from Illustrator. When you import it here, it's going to be just one object. But if I go into edit mode and I just select this, like any point in here, or deselect everything and hit L, like I said before, you can just select linked and you can move it anywhere you want. So I did that with the M and I adjusted some positioning over here as well. So I technically did use edit mode because I cannot use it ever. It's just something that is part of my workflow always. Okay, and that's really it. I never talked about the landscape thumbnails, but I just flip everything and I have a different cover for the landscape book. And I adjust anything that doesn't look right. So for the ghost, I had to actually flip it because it doesn't really look right this way. So I cannot just select everything and rotate it. And you can see that on the thumbnail of this video. Okay, that's all for this week, and I'll see you on Instagram. Bye!